Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome cohort 11 and 12. It's been an honor to present my, should I say, long-term student, Ian Harr. This is basically a moment, for a chair, a moment of joy, because we have worked so hard, and there are ups and downs. Some results are not coming. Some results are not as expected. So we had to go back to the drawing board, and Chi-Chien was very helpful as well. She is the second member on Ian's dissertation committee. So this is an interesting topic that you will enjoy, and you will see that how the private-public partnership works in the real world, as well as the growth companies and their accounting earnings quality. So without further ado, I welcome you all to Ian Harr's dissertation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, BK. I don't think so. Everyone hear me okay? Good. So I want to thank my committee, first of all, who have just been the most patient, kind, understanding, but also helpful and rigorous and thorough with all of the data that I've had to pour through over the last 4 or 5 years. It's really taken me quite a bit of time to get through all this data. It's not easy to collect, but they have been so guiding, and I can't thank you enough. BK and Chi-Chien are here. Mayor is watching in from home because she's sick today, so we hope she feels better. So I wanted to introduce my topic. I am examining public-private partnerships. I'm also examining emerging growth companies. And I'm also one of the first to look at the intersection between the two. So I'll explain what those are. There's a lot of acronyms that are going to fly around, so you're going to see, we'll try not to get lost in the woods. Thank you for being here. So this presentation is organized as follows. I'm going to discuss the research motivation. I'll outline the research gaps and the problems and the questions. Third, I present Essay 1, which examines financial reporting quality among emerging growth companies. And fourth, I present Essay 2, which examines the firms that participate in public-private partnerships. And I'm going to test the interaction in Essay 2 between those two types of organizations. Finally, I'm going to discuss the contribution, the limitations, the implications, and then I will welcome your questions. So the Jobs Act of 2012 created the Emerging Growth Company Classification, EGC, which allows newly public firms, new IPOs, to provide scale disclosure and exemption from certain regulatory requirements, including auditor attestation, requirement under SOX 404B. Separately, public-private partnerships involve long-term contractual arrangements where private firms perform public functions under agreements with government entities. These two settings create an important institutional contrast. EGC status reduces certain regulatory disclosure and oversight requirements, and PPP arrangements typically involve contractual monitoring, where accounting information is used to evaluate performance and enforce contracts. While prior research has examined regulatory disclosure and oversight requirements, this is the first study that's looked at the interaction between the two. So that makes this study unique. Financial reporting quality is important because it affects how investors allocate capital and monitor managers within the firm. Prior research shows that higher financial reporting quality is associated with lower cost of capital and more efficient investment choices. Institutional environments can influence reporting incentives, and that's why it's important to understand where they are doing that. The Jobs Act reduced disclosure requirements and internal control oversight for emerging growth companies. In contrast, public-private partnerships often involve contractual oversight. So financial reporting quality is widely viewed as a multidimensional construct. To examine how institutional settings affect reporting outcomes, we first need a clear conceptual framework for financial reporting quality. Financial reporting quality refers to the extent to which a financial statement faithfully represents the firm's underlying economic performance. Conceptually, high-quality financial reporting has several core dimensions. Earnings should reflect underlying economic events rather than managerial incentives. Gains and losses should be recognized in a timely manner. Accounting estimates should contain less errors and less managerial bias. On the institution side, disclosure requirements are supposed to mitigate financial reporting and improve financial reporting quality. The monitoring intensity, again, is supposed to be built into a public-private partnership DNA. So it's widely viewed, we're going to measure accrual quality, and accrual quality measures the precision of accrual estimates relative to realized cash flows. Discretionary accruals capture abnormal accounting adjustments made within GAAP, generally accepted accounting principles. Real earnings management captures operational decisions undertaken to influence reported earnings. Using multiple proxies helps mitigate measurement concerns and provides a more comprehensive review of financial reporting behavior. So consistent patterns across these measures provide stronger evidence than relying on any one single proxy. This slide just summarizes the predicted reporting outcomes. So PPP, or public-private partnership, participation introduces contractual monitoring and oversight into the equation. Greater monitoring intensity constrains opportunistic reporting behavior. As a result, we might expect higher accrual quality and lower discretionary accruals among PPP firms. In contrast, EGC status reduces disclosure requirements and internal control oversight. Lower monitoring intensity may increase managerial discretion. So these predictions form the basis for the hypothesis tested in this dissertation. This study does address several gaps in the literature. First, PPP research provides limited empirical evidence on earnings-based accounting outcomes in US capital markets. Second, the research on the Jobs Act has largely focused on IPO activity and capital formation, with less attention to financial reporting quality after firms go public. And then third, prior studies have not examined how regulatory disclosure relief and contractual monitoring interact within the same empirical setting. So this is a unique, novel study. These gaps have led to these three research problems. The disclosure relief problem asks whether reduced regulatory oversight weakens reporting discipline. The contractual monitoring problem asks whether participation in PPP arrangements strengthens reporting discipline. And then the institutional interaction problem asks which force dominates when regulatory relief and contractual monitoring coexist. These problems translate into three research questions. First, how is financial reporting quality associated with emerging growth company status? Second, how is financial reporting quality associated with participation in public-private partnerships? And then third, how does public-private partnership participation influence the relationship between EGC status and financial reporting quality? So my dissertation is structured in two essays. Essay 1 examines whether EGC status is associated with accrual-based financial reporting quality. Essay 2 examines whether PPP participation is associated with financial reporting quality and whether PPP participation moderates the relationship between EGC status and FRQ. This slide presents a conceptual framework that connects the institutional environment to financial reporting quality. The central idea is that institutional arrangements influence reporting incentives through monitoring intensity and assurance mechanisms. On the left side is the regulatory channel, represented by emerging growth company status. EGC firms receive scaled disclosure and may delay the adoption of certain accounting standards. They are also exempt from auditor attestation of internal controls under SOX Section 404B. These provisions reduce external oversight, which may increase managerial reporting discretion. Below that is the assurance mechanism, which is the internal control audit under SOX 404B. On the right side, the contracting channel are the PPPs. So under the PPP framework, these are long-term contracts and performance metrics that are mutually agreed upon between the private sector partner and the public sector partner. And that's the monitoring aspect that is supposed to prevent firm managers from performing real earnings management. So I'll start essay 1, looking at EGC status and accrual-based financial reporting quality. This slide just defines what an emerging growth company is under the Jobs Act. A firm can elect EGC status after an IPO and generally remains an EGC up to 5 years until it exceeds certain revenue, debt, or public float thresholds. The key point here is that if EGC status is a temporary classification that's tied to firm size and growth after the IPO and during that window, then firms will get reduced to disclosure and oversight for that entire period. So next I'm going to summarize what prior research suggests these provisions might imply for financial reporting behavior. This slide and the next summarize the 3 main EGC provisions and why they might matter for financial reporting quality. First, delayed adoption of new accounting standards can reduce comparability between EGC and non-EGC firms, and they can potentially increase uncertainty for investors. The second, scale disclosure can reduce the amount of information that's available to outsiders, investors. In general, less disclosure can increase information asymmetry and make external monitoring harder. Third, EGC status can reduce certain oversight mechanisms during the post-IPO period. The general concern in the literature is that less disclosure and less oversight can increase reporting discretion. So this matters. Back up. So prior research shows that when firms have material weaknesses in internal controls, they tend to have lower accrual quality and higher misreporting risk. That makes sense because weak controls make it easier for errors or intentional misstatements to occur. And why that matters for EGCs is because many EGC firms are exempt from 404 attestation by auditors. So the question is whether that reduction in assurance translates into weaker accrual discipline. This slide also notes that EGC firms are often innovative or high growth, and those firm characteristics can cut both ways for FRQ. So it's important to control for underlying firm characteristics when estimating EGC effects. So next I'll anchor this in broader financial reporting quality measures. FRQ is commonly measured using accrual quality, discretionary accrual, and real earnings management. Traditionally in the accounting research, those are the primary measures that are used to measure FRQ because it's a multidimensional construct. Financial reporting matters because it helps reduce information asymmetry and supports efficient capital allocation. Higher reporting quality generally is associated with better market conditions and outcomes, including lower cost of capital. And then finally, weaker disclosure and monitoring environments tend to increase monitoring risk and misreporting risk. So the theoretical logic is monitoring and assurance can reduce reporting discretion, and reduce monitoring could increase it. So again, my research questions are, how is financial reporting quality associated with EGC status? Second, is EGC status related to real earnings management, meaning managers that are shifting operating decisions to affect reported earnings? So these questions lead directly to a testable hypothesis. The hypothesis is that I predicted that EGC status is negatively associated with accrual-based financial reporting quality relative to non-EGC firms. The intuition is pretty straightforward. If EGC status reduces disclosure and monitoring, managers may have greater opportunity to use reporting discretion, which could reduce accrual-based reporting quality. So now I'm going to describe the data and the methods used to test this. I used a sample from 2012 to 2024. 2012 is the first year of the Jobs Act, so that seemed a logical place to look. I actually went a year back to 2011 so that I could capture some of the data coming into 2011. I obtained firm-level financial statements and data and EGC status through CompuStat North America in Words. And from Audit Analytics, I obtained audit and internal control information, including SOX Section 404B, exemption status, and auditor identity. Industry classifications follow the FAMA French 48 industry groupings. I dropped financial institutions, which is common in FRQ research. And my EGC indicator is a 0 or 1, so it's a binary variable. And I'm excluding foreign firms that are listed in the United States, so no cross-listed firms, and observations with missing accounting information. So all the continuous variables except for size were Windsorized. And that's common in FRQ research as well. Remember that EGCs are smaller firms, so if I Windsorized size, that would drop almost all of my population. So the final data set really was small, consisted of 2,628 firm year observations. It's very tough to get to some of this data, but I used this model, and I apologize for its length. I used 15 variables to measure. So foreign operations, whether the auditor was a Big Four, did they have substantial litigation expenses, intangible expenses, losses, return on assets, and standard CFO and standard sales or standard deviation of sales and cash flow, sales growth and market to book value. So a lot of variables in this equation. The coefficient of interest, though, is EGC, which captures whether firms classified as emerging growth companies exhibit different reporting outcomes relative to comparable non-EGC firms. Okay. This is a slide that really discloses the history in the accounting research of how FRQ is measured, and in prior research, and you can see this goes back several years, back to 1991 even, with the Jones model. FRQ has been studied extensively in the accounting research, in the accounting literature. The best are really the Dechev, and a lot of studies only use perhaps maybe the first two or the first three. I include real earnings management, which adds another component. And so for real earnings management, we actually form a composite of the three real earnings managements: absolute cash flow from operations, discretionary expenses, and production. So this table represents the association between the EGC status and the three measures of financial reporting quality. The first two columns show accrual-based measures, absolute discretionary accrual, and accrual quality. And EGC status is not statistically significant in either specification. In the third column, though, EGC status is positively associated with signed real earnings management. That suggests that there is some evidence of operational reporting adjustments. However, you can see that the robustness test, in the tests that follow, the robustness tests, this association weakens once observable firm characteristics are balanced. So one concern in this setting is that EGC firms would differ systematically from non-EGC firms' observable characteristics. Those differences could drive the baseline association rather than the EGC status itself. To address that concern, I implement entropy balancing to re-weight the control group so that the covariate distributions match those of the EGC firms. This approach ensures that first and second moments of the observed characteristics are balanced prior to estimation. In the baseline REM specification, the EGC coefficient is modestly negative and statistically significant. After entropy balancing, the coefficient attenuates in the magnitude and becomes statistically insignificant. This attenuation suggests that the baseline association was driven by observable firm differences rather than the EGC status. So overall, EGC status is not significantly associated with accrual-based financial reporting quality once firm characteristics are taken into account and controlled for. The initial association with real earnings management weakens after entropy balancing, and that suggests the baseline difference reflects underlying firm characteristics rather than the EGC status itself. However, firms exempt from 404B auditor attestation, I found, exhibit higher discretionary accruals, indicating that audit assurance plays an important part in maintaining accrual discipline. Okay, so while SA1 focuses on regulatory relief through EGC status, SA2 is going to examine the opposite institutional setting, public-private partnerships, where financial reporting is embedded in contractual monitoring environments. So SA2 is my participation in the PPPs and accrual-based FRQ. There's been literature on public-private partnerships. This is a very interesting area. Public-private partnerships started really in European countries and Australia and Asia, really when infrastructure needed to be improved. So much older societies than the United States have been using partnerships between the public companies and the government for hundreds of years. It's sort of new in this country, and it's really a function of when, what our government's budgets look like, right? So, for example, funding for things like NASA, are down in recent years, and so the public has stepped up. We have SpaceX that are coming in and other firms that are coming in to try to bridge the gap between the government's maybe perhaps lack of funding and what private industry is willing to do and able to do better than the government even can. And as long as there's monitoring, those partnerships should coexist well, and then things get done. So my dissertation examines whether EGC status and PPP participation are systematically associated with financial reporting quality, and whether PPP participation conditions the EGC FRQ relationship. It leads to my hypothesis that firms that participate in public-private partnerships exhibit higher accrual-based financial reporting quality because of the monitoring relative to non-PPP firms. And then my H3 is the participation in public-private partnerships will moderate the association between EGC status and accrual-based financial reporting quality, such that the relationship between EGC and FRQ differs for PPPs and non-PPPs. I told you there was a lot of acronyms here. I'll let that sink in for a minute. So the theoretical basis around this is there's an agency theory that says that the principal-agent relationship exists where agents have more information about their actions than principals. So in this case, the government is the principal, the private company is the agent. And so these are characterized normally by high levels of information asymmetry. There's also greater conflict and higher agency costs. So Jensen and Meckling, which I'm sure all of you have read, governs this agreement and this relationship strongly. Information asymmetry motivates firms to engage in earnings management, however, and it's visible in the form of higher accruals, and that can lead to lower earnings quality. So clearly, PPPs fall right within this agency relationship. EGC exemption, PPP projects have information asymmetry. There's been several studies that have shown that firms in PPPs it can be a costly endeavor. The private sector firm is not willing to reveal commercially confidential information, which again causes information asymmetry. But for firms in PPPs, it's untested whether the relationship itself or the reporting environment impacts earnings quality. Because prior research is really largely focused on, or it's ignored in the accounting literature. It's really measuring performance, ex post. So there was a recent study in 2022 of Chinese PPP firms, and they found that they engage in greater upward earnings management and real activity manipulation after such participation, which increases the likelihood of earnings management. So what we think is going to happen in the PPP arrangement, which is more monitoring, higher financial reporting quality, they're not finding that in China's firms. But a study like this, an empirical study on US firms, hasn't been done, and I think I understand why after collecting the data. It's not easy to get to. Other countries make PPP information available widely, easily. You can go to any website for London or Germany or England, France, and find a whole listing of all the firms that participate with the government. In the United States, you have to go to other means to find that data, and I'll explain that in a minute. So you have to go to, I had to go to the government websites, sam.gov, Federal Procurement Data System, FPSDS, and extract the data for firms that have government contracts. So government contracting, in my study, is taking the proxy for participation in a PPP. Even then, the data isn't clean. It doesn't match up well with CompuStat data. It doesn't give you a GV key. It gives you a UEI, a unique entity identifier. And with no other information that would perhaps link to words or CompuStat. So I used fuzzy matching. I used other name identifying lookup to match the data, which really did take quite a bit of time. So the same types of methods I used on the EGC data, I used on this data. I excluded foreign firms. I used FAMA French 48. I also gathered data from really 2011 to 2024 because I wanted to, again, try to match the PPP data with the EGC data. So I went back several years. And then I merged those databases. I also obtained data, again, from audit analytics, similar to how I did for the EGC population, and excluded financial service firms, Windsorized all the continuous variables except for size, again, at the 1st and 99th percentile. So the full FRQ sample was 85,452 firms. The EGC observable subsample was 47,864 firm years. My model is similar but smaller. I study many of the same variables, and again, a lot of these were variables that are used in other FRQ research. So it wasn't a matter of dropping anything that wasn't already used in previous models. Discretionary accruals capture deviations from expected accrual generating processes conditional on firm fundamentals. So because PPP participation may influence managerial reporting discretion through monitoring and contracting incentives, discretionary accrual captures the accrual-based dimension of financial reporting quality. So that's my measures for FRQ. There we go. My descriptive statistics, you can see that I measured using the Kotari model, and that my observations were standard across all the means, across all the variables. The simple Pearson correlations show that PPP participation is negatively associated with accrual magnitude, but the magnitude is very small because both PPP status and financial reporting quality are correlated with firm characteristics and industry composition. I relied on multivariate fixed rate regressions to estimate the conditional association. You can see that across all four measures, the modified Jones, Kotari, Jones itself, and then Kotari 2016, which are all measures of those four measures that you saw on the slide earlier, PPP was significant in all four models. So that was good. That was a good result. PPP coefficient then is consistently negative and highly significant across all of these discretionary accrual models. Okay, let's go there. PPP participation is associated with about a 0.60 reduction in discretionary accrual magnitude. And given that the mean is approximately 6.3, this represents about a 9 or 10% reduction. So economically, that's meaningful and consistent with stronger accrual discipline among PPP firms. So my main model, the real earnings management model. So the real earnings management, like I said, it's a composite. And so I put the composite in the right side, number 4. And I put I measured each of the individual variables that make up that, measures that make up that composite measure. in as well. And again, you can see the PPP is significant across even both the signed REM, composite REM, and standard CFO production and discretionary expenses. So these results show that PPP is associated with mixed REM component effects. Signed REM is positive and significant. The pattern is driven by, I think, reductions in discretionary expenses. In contrast to the EGC findings, which show little systematic change in accrual-based reporting, the PPP results show or suggest that contractual monitoring environments may shape reporting incentives through different channels. And you can see the interaction test. So the coefficient is positive and significant. I should say that a negative number indicates higher accrual quality, higher financial reporting quality. For the interaction between the PPP and EGC, that is not significant, however. So this test where I interacted the two, it was disappointing to see that the interaction was not significant. So in summary, SA2 results support H2. PPP participation is associated with lower discretionary accruals in the interaction sample, but H3 is not supported. The PPP-EGC interaction is not statistically significant. The REM results are mixed, with signed real earnings management is positive and significant for PPP firms. So these findings highlight how different institutional monitoring environments shape reporting incentives. PPP firms embed firms in long horizon oversight, where accounting numbers feed contract monitoring. Contracting oversight doesn't appear to offset or amplify EGC-related effects, though, because that PPP-EGC interaction was insignificant. But the implication of this is that contracting environment is an informative dimension of a firm's reporting monitoring. So it's an interesting interaction that needs to be studied more. Overall, EGC status not significantly associated with accrual-based financial reporting quality after controlling for firm characteristics and fixed effects. But the initial association with real earnings management attenuates after balancing observable firm characteristics. So there are baseline differences that reflect underlying firm attributions. PPP participation is associated with stronger accrual discipline and modest real activity. So overall, the evidence suggests that contractual monitoring environments do influence reporting incentives more than the regulatory disclosure relief alone. This contributes to the academic literature. It's an empirical study of financial reporting quality of US PPPs and EGCs. There's a scarcity of these kinds of studies that are done largely because the data is so difficult to get to, I imagine. And there's been several calls for more research in this area, especially in the accounting literature. This does clarify the role of regulatory relief and monitoring in an agency framework. There's no evidence that EGC frameworks systematically impair reporting quality, but that should be looked at more. But it does offer direction for effective decision-making. And local, regional, national government agencies should look more at the impact this relationship has on financial reporting quality. Seems I have the same slide. So my limitations were a few. an observational research design. I mean, these results reflect, like most archival accounting studies, this analysis it uses an observational research design, and the results should be interpreted as associations rather than causal effects. Firms that participate in PPP contracts, they may differ in ways that are not fully understandable or observable. In addition, the PPP measure is a firm-level indicator, and it doesn't capture variation in contract characteristics. So finally, the mixed REM results suggest that further research could examine specific contract features, like audit requirements or government oversight mechanisms, to better understand the reporting incentives. Finally, data coverage is an issue. PPP identification relies on available project databases and public disclosures. A lot of PPP participations, a lot of that relationship is not disclosed in SEC reporting. It's not disclosed openly and publicly like it is in European firms or in Australia or Asia. So data is always going to be a challenge or a struggle. And now I'll take your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. That was a good presentation. So I have a couple of questions. If you could explain the different RAM, like the real earnings management. So I have seen like you have used 4. So if you can explain and what does each signify?
Sure. Let me go back to.
Also, we have Mayor Leong with us. She is the reviewer for Jan's dissertation. I am sorry that I forgot to mention her at the beginning. So thank you, Mayor, for joining with us, even though you are sick. Thank you, appreciate it.
Yep. Much easier to show you. So the real earnings management really was not invented, but brought forward by Roy Chattery in 2006. And it measures the absolutes of cash flow from operations, production, and discretionary expenses. And so it uses a negative cash flow from operations and adds production and subtracts discretionary expenses. And so the logic there is that if a firm is if they're managing their earnings, which means they're trying to manipulate, right, their earnings after the reporting period has happened, that you would see that outcome by looking at cash flows, production, and discretionary expenses. So there's an inverse relationship between cash flows and earnings, and also between discretionary expenses and earnings. Meaning, if you were going to manage your company's earnings, you would try to reduce your expenses and increase your revenue, right? So that's why production is a positive, and discretionary expenses are a negative. The same with cash flow. So you would find the answer to whether a firm has managed their earnings by looking at each component of REM. A signed REM or a composite REM is generally accepted, and many studies don't look at each individual piece, they just use the REM index. But I decided to look at each one individually and found that PPP was significant across all 4.
Excellent. Another question is, can you explain the EGC and PPP? Like, how do you interact with them? Like, what would be their association? Yeah,
the interaction. So those two, I could answer that in many different ways, but they're both monitoring mechanisms. There's monitoring that goes on with each type of firm, if you will. So the PPP firms are supposed to be monitored by the government agency itself, who are checking in on the private firm. And so you would think that financial reporting quality would be very high. On the other side, we have these emerging growth companies where because of these relaxed disclosures and the regulatory, that's a regulatory effect because the SEC doesn't require, then those you expect the financial reporting quality to be very, very low. So the two really should balance each other out. But the important thing that I wanted to point out with this paper, with this dissertation, was that those are two measures of a company, and they have competing pressures. And so one doesn't balance out the other, it would appear, meaning the positive effect that a PPP has with their monitoring, the positive effect that has on financial reporting quality, doesn't, when it's offset by the FRQ lowering EGC, doesn't seem to be a significant interaction. And that was surprising for this study.
So if I understood you correctly, you are saying that emerging growth companies, or EGC, they fall out from their status after year 5.
They do
but
fall
then a firm can still remain PPP, right? After that, or it has a duration as well?
It's a status that they choose. They can only live in that world for 5 years or less if they rise above certain thresholds. So if they rise above, let's say, $1.2 billion, and then if they have, if they have large market values of their stock, they will immediately fall out of that emerging growth company status. So it's an election after IPO, but they could easily fall out of it if they get large.
Got it. Thank you very much. I think I am done with my questions. Now, Professor Chi Cheng.
Hey, Ian, great presentation.
Thank you.
So I want to piggyback on BK's question, the real activity earning management. So your result actually show different signs, right?
Correct.
So can you explain how you will interpret that results?
I would if I could go back. This seems to be not working again. Is that better? There we go. Okay. So going back to, I think you were talking about SA2. Not that one. I think it was this one.
This one.
This one, right. So across all of these,
So
remember,
the PPP company tend to have more cash flow from operating,
right, correct.
and then less.
Well, remember that these are opposite signs. So the lower, the more positive the number is, the higher the earnings quality is.
Yeah, so the PPP company actually has less quality, financial reporting quality for what's this? Is that the production
Correct.
cost.
Correct.
So they tend to cut their production costs to manage earnings, and then they tend to cut their discretionary expense. And then so these, like if you just look at those three components, they are conflicting with each other, right? So what's your motivation to present all three if you cannot explain that well? Because most of the studies I have read, they just present one combined score.
Combined index.
So then if the individual one does not provide you with any insight and create some kind of problem, that you have to explain from the reviewers, you are digging a hole for yourself.
I was digging for more information. I was digging to see whether any one component of the REM index would have a relationship that I didn't quite understand. And as it turned out, I didn't need to. But you can see that just from the number of observations, they have different, there's some, like the REM production or the discretionary expenses, you drop a certain number of observations just by looking at those individual components. So it is a problematic view of that. And that's probably why most studies do just use the REM index, because they don't want to muddy the waters with this.
And potentially, because when you cut the production expense and discretionary expenses,
Right.
long-term wise, it hurts the companies.
Yeah.
So then the PPP companies are trying to manage their earnings for, hurting themselves in the long term. That's kind of hard to explain.
It is hard to explain.
So my next question will be, for PPP firms, you mentioned that it's hard to get data for the United States company, so then you use a proxy. So if the reviewers challenge the use of the proxy or question that, how do you defend your choice? And then if other US studies actually use the same proxy for that?
There aren't other US studies. So this is the one. The data is so difficult to get to. So if you, in my mind, it makes great sense, right? If you are partnering with the government, if I can go to the government website, the procurement website, and I can see you've got a long-term contract with the government and you're earning, I actually chose, contracts that were over $25,000 just to make sure they weren't insignificant. That's a sign that that relationship exists, whether it's, going to be there forever or not. I mean, that's a sign that at least there was a contract involved. And for me, the contract was the impetus for including them as a PPP. Okay. That's the proxy is contracting with the federal government.
Okay. And then from the reviewer point of view, I usually like to see competing arguments for the development of hypothesis, especially if you did not find the significant result for the EGC. So then you probably want to spend a little more time thinking about the competing argument, because that creates tension, and reviewers or readers prefer tensions over like, okay, yeah, sure, I can see where you're going, and that the results are kind of expected. So maybe even for the PPP, you want to think of some competing, I think you have some kind of buried in your discussion, like the China studies, they actually found the opposite direction. And then so in your discussion, you may want to discuss like the differences between US PPP and China, the settings, and then kind of explain why your results are opposite.
From reading that study, the Chinese firms operate in a heavier regulatory environment. So that for me was, and that paper even mentions, that's likely why they were showing that type of result. That wasn't the result that they expected it to be either. And so they summed it up with the implication or suggestion that it was because Chinese firms do operate in that heavy regulatory environment where they're not free. Sometimes the partnerships are forced upon them, and they're not free to choose. The government may, in that study, it said that there were instances where the government said, you're going to be working with us now, and here's what we're going to pay you, and here's the length of the contract. So the terms were dictated to them, and that does have an impact on FRQ. In their study, a negative effect.
Okay, so you may want to kind of explain that, the opposite result. And then just some thoughts, because EGC companies, There are selection bias, right? Because they are younger, they are new IPO companies for at least just the first 5 years.
Right.
So maybe take out the size as a control variable to see if that make a difference. And then also, this is for future study. Because they are exempt from the SOX 404B, right? That
Right.
means the auditors do not need to attest to their internal controls.
Right.
So then we don't know if they have internal control weaknesses unless they want to report it. And then so maybe you can compare the last year of them as an EGC company with the previous year to see if there's any differences in their internal control weaknesses. So that you have to get the database on the, I mean, I don't know if it's available.
I like that. So your thought is that when they roll out of when they're getting ready to roll out of the EGC 5-year period, they may try to strengthen their controls so that they can be more widely accepted to the rest of the
or
market.
the first year they come out of the EGC, and then you will they have to have the 404 auditor attestation, and then you can compare that with the non-EGC companies, and then match on size to see if that have any interesting result. I was just having that thought when
It's a
I
great
listened to your
idea for
presentation.
future research. Yeah. Absolutely. That's a very good suggestion.
You can do like piggybacking on that. So you can do basically year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5 as well. Because that can kind of make it interesting as well to the reader, that you know how EGC transitioned into better or worse, right? Or if there is a trend that you observe.
Yes.
Because you have the, I think, the time frame as well, like with the first year as a EGC, second year as a EGC, and so on.
Yeah.
But that's a very great suggestion.
That's a very good
I just
suggestion.
have another thought.
Okay.
Because you did not find significant result for EGC.
No,
but
I
then
did
in
not.
accounting literature, now we're trying to encourage people, like no result still is a finding, right? And then to you, and I'm thinking that actually that is a good finding because the Job Act actually allows company to have the reduced reporting obligation. So this is actually a comforting findings to
Yes.
support that act.
It is a comforting finding.
So then
You're right.
you can make it a little more positive tone towards your findings, and then that is actually to assure the investors that the EGC companies they are at least equally
Not manipulating it.
correct.
Yeah.
So rather than I didn't find anything,
Right.
and then but put it in a more positive tone.
I like that. Thank you. That's a great suggestion.
Okay, so I guess next is the
Mayor?
Dr. Liang.
Yep. I can. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Okay.
PPP and EGC overlaps, you really don't have that many observations.
Right.
As a result, I suspect that the null result that you find in your SA3 for the interaction is also because of low power issues.
Right.
So that's my first comment. The second comment, I'm going to go back to some of the discussion we had on real earnings management. So primarily you have been citing Roy Chaudhary and Zhang 2012 paper for the two accruals measurement. I have always had a concern with the composite REM measure, which is you adding the abnormal cash flows, the abnormal production costs, and the abnormal discretionary expenses. So you have been citing both of those papers, but I caution against misrepresenting some of the prior literature because I have not found that any of the REM literature adding them three. Zhang, for example, 2012, they were adding the abnormal residuals for the production costs and discretionary expenditures together, only those two, skipping the cash flow. The reason for that is the production cost and discretionary expenses work the same way for financial reporting quality. Earnings management is done through lowering costs to boost reported earnings, right?
Right.
However, the effect of all of the real activities management on cash flows, producing abnormal cash flows, would be ambiguous. For example, if you have channel stuffing, if you are shifting, if you're just reducing your production costs, all of those are going to increase your operating cash flow. But then discretionary expenses could actually decrease your operating cash flow. So grouping abnormal accruals, the residuals for operating cash flows would actually introduce measurement error in your REM measure. So my recommendation, which is something I left in the comment, is do the same thing for REM, break it out into components and do it for EGC as well as PPP. You do it for PPP already.
Yeah.
I agree with that, but do it for EGC as well. Because as you see from the PPP results, that the direction of the effect for REM is actually different, right?
Yeah.
So I recommend that you break it out for all of them.
Okay.
And if you want to do a composite measure, only add the production costs and discretionary expenditures together, because that is actually following Zhang 2012. So don't include the cash flow component.
Okay.
Right. So the last comment I have is with respect to your choice for financial reporting quality proxies. I know that during the presentation as well as in the write-up, you have been referring to following prior literature. There's nothing wrong with that. However, for your setting, because it's new, because it's novel, because nobody has done it before, and the fact that the companies that you're studying, the underlying fundamentals are different. So Roy Choudhury, their sample period, for example, goes back to 1980 something to 2001. So the type of firms that he used is going to be more like industrial firms, not really the not possibly like the same way that EGC firms are, right? Yeah. So EGC firms are, in your sample, you also have mentioned they're intangible intensity, they're early stage, a lot of bio firms, pharmaceutical doing research. Right. The nature of these firms will very likely be behaving very differently from the nature of the industrial firms that Roy Choudhury was studying. As a result, can you explain as to why you picked these previous, I guess, well-studied characteristics of financial reporting qualities, rather than, for example, some more direct proxies for financial reporting quality, such as the presence of internal control weakness? The reason I'm asking is because I think the data exists. And I think that would be, if you use more direct proxies for financial reporting quality, that could actually be a more direct evidence and give you a bit more power to identify a result, rather than using some of these more convoluted ones where you have to estimate accruals and trying to do panel data, all of that. Okay. Yeah. I will share with you after this defense the white paper I found that is published by PCAOB in 2018. Yeah. They collected data on a little over 1,000 EGC firms by November 2018. They found that over 600 something firms of that 1,100 firms, so like basically like 36% or something, I remember. These are shell companies and reported no revenue. Yep. So that is, again, suggesting the type of firms that you are studying in your setting is fundamentally different from industrial firms that have normal, continuous cost of goods sold or costs, discretionary production expenses. Yeah. Okay. Also, of the 1,100, I believe 480 something firms actually report internal control weaknesses.
Yeah.
So that to me suggests that there are more direct financial reporting quality measures that you can use. An extension to your research, and perhaps the next paper you can explore, is study the actual disclosure qualities, which is more of a textual-based analysis. And now, given that we have AI tools to help you, I think that could be a meaningful extension based off of this great work that you have been doing.
Thank you very much.
So thank you. Those are all my comments.
Thank you very much, Dr. Liang. I think you're right. The PCAOB publishes an annual report on emerging growth companies. They don't name them by name, but they point to trends and they have all of the summary data. A lot of the EGCs are SPACs, and that does play a part in why there's so little data on there. They're shell companies, they're SPACs, they're just not. There's no meaningful data there, which is why my observations dropped so low. And that does require a measure. So the other measure that I was looking at with the EGC, with SA1, was the SOX 404B exemption. And I think for that measure, there was variability. So I can pick this up now, and again, based on your recommendation as well, to study that more in the future and use other measures like that, as opposed to the old conventional methods that have been used since 1991.
All of these are good practices in terms of understanding what prior literature has done and also identifying good proxies for your own setting. So as you morph into a real academic, these are all great learning experiences. So I commend you in taking on that.
Thank you very, very much. I appreciate it. It's funny that the financial reporting quality construct there's almost a stigma about it. If you don't use DeChow and DeChav, you're nothing, And so new measures have to be invented because the world is different and the companies that are forming IPOs are different now. So, perfect. Thank you.
Anybody has a question? Anyone? No? No one? So, great presentation and well done, Ian. And, it's been a journey for you since we have both cohorts here, and, cohort 11 is going to be starting that journey, and cohort 12 wants to see what you've, experienced. Can you tell them a little bit what was that like for you and what kind of advice, not to put you on the spot.
No, that's...
At least to share some words of wisdom. Thank you.
Well, first of all, and I forgot to thank you, Praveen, because meeting you at the perfect intersection of my intellectual curiosity when all that was budding. I had just finished my master's degree, and I was looking for something else, another challenge. This has always been on my bucket list. I don't know, many of you probably have the same thing. This is something you've always wanted to accomplish. And meeting Praveen, I did my due diligence on this program, and it's the best program around anywhere, like in the country, really. And a number of my cohort members, I started out in cohort 7. I got COVID, had to drop out, went to cohort 8. It's been a journey. Several, people. My family passed away, and life happens, right? But the perseverance and the patience, combined with the strength of the professors, who I see a couple of them in front of me, who are my best professors, really elevated me to want more from myself and pushed me to lengths that I didn't know that I could go to. So, combination of just great professors and a great program. I never minded driving up here once a month, and it was always such a pleasure to be in classes where I was so intellectually stimulated and challenged. And I just never met a finer group of teachers And the program is first rate, as I'm sure you're all finding out. So keep with it. There's going to be days when you are unsure of yourself, whether you can make it. Keep going anyway. Keep going anyway. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I'd also like to, I don't know if any of you noticed that Dr. Chichen Lee is here as well. She will be the one leading the session on accounting. So a few of the students are here as well. So thank you, everyone. And
Thank you.
thanks. We'll
Thank you for
see
coming.
you in class. And thank you. Yep.
Thank you.